Elsie Hale turned her father's wren over in her palm one last time, before she let her aunts dress her for a man she had met only once, and she told herself she would not cry until the carriage was out of sight of the cottage. The wedding was 3 hours off, and already the debt that had bought it sat in the room with them, unspoken, taking up the good chair by the fire. Tallow and rosewater, and the particular smell of a kettle boiled too many times that morning, filled the low kitchen, and outside the window the yard was white, with a heat that had not broken in 11 days. The wren had one wing finished, and one left rough, her father's hands having stopped a year before he could smooth it, and she kept it now, the way another woman might have kept a ring, closed inside a fist inside a pocket, proof that somebody had once made something for her with no ledger attached to it. Aunt Temperance stood behind her working the laces of a gown that had been let out twice, and was still not quite right through the shoulders, and Aunt Prudence hovered at the door, wringing a handkerchief that did not need wringing. "Weep if you must," Temperance said, not unkindly, "but do it before he comes for you, not after. A man does not need to watch it, and a girl does not need him watching." Prudence said the magpie that morning had come alone, which everybody knew meant sorrow, and Temperance said the magpie was welcome to its opinion same as everybody else's, and neither one had paid the mill's debt. That was the whole of it, laid bare in a sentence, the way Temperance laid everything bare, without cruelty, and without much comfort either. Elsie had heard the figure named exactly once, by the solicitor who came to read her father's affairs a fortnight after the funeral, and it had sat in her chest since like a stone swallowed whole. £412 owed to the Harrow estate on a loan her father swore he had never taken, and could no longer argue about from inside a grave. "Weep and endure," Prudence said. "That was what your mother was told, and her mother before that, and it did neither of them any lasting harm." Temperance's hands went still on the lacing. "It did them the harm it did them," she said. "We simply were not asked to watch." Elsie did not weep. She held the wren a moment longer, pressed her thumb along the unfinished wing the way she always did when the day asked more of her than she had to give it, and set it into the pocket sewn inside her sleeve, close to the wrist, where a doctor might take a pulse. A wheel sounded on the lane before either aunt could say anything further, iron striking the dry ruts, and then a second wheel, and the black lacquer of a coach came into the yard with a crest on the door that none of the 3 women in that kitchen had ever expected to see resting outside their gate. Prudence went white as the heat allowed, and Temperance only looked out through the glass a long moment, reading something in the horse's or the driver's face that she did not share aloud, and said, "Well, he has sent the good carriage. That is either a courtesy or a warning, and I have never yet learned to tell one from the other in a duke." The road to Haramir ran 2 hours through country that grew steadily stranger to Elsie's eye, hedgerows replaced by walls, walls replaced eventually by an iron gate standing open as though it had been waiting since morning, and beyond the gate an avenue of limes so old and so evenly spaced that they might have been planted by a single patient hand across a single patient lifetime. The air changed before the house came into view, cooling as the drive dipped, and she caught the smell of water before she saw it, green and mineral. And then the mere opened out on the left of the carriage, wide and flat and silvered with the last of the afternoon, a single swan moving across it without any visible effort at all, as if it had simply decided the water owed it passage. She would learn later that it had once been a pair. Haramir itself rose the colour of wet stone, long-fronted, more windows than she could count without losing her place, and stood before it, waiting with a stillness that she mistook at first for indifference, was the Duke of Harrow. He was younger than the rumours from Combe Ashton had led her to expect, and graver, dressed with no more ornament than his rank required, and he crossed the gravel to hand her down from the carriage himself rather than let a footman do it, which she understood was either very good manners or a very deliberate performance of them. His hand closed around hers, dry, careful. Gone the instant it was no longer needed. "You are Miss Hale," he said. "I am," she said, and did not yet know how to address the rest of it, so she let it sit. "I am sorry for the heat of the road," he said. "We do not choose our weather any better than we choose most things." It was, she thought, an odd thing for a duke to say about the sun, as though he included himself among the governed rather than the governing. And she filed it away without knowing yet what to do with it. Behind him on the steps, a woman of perhaps 60 stood with her hands folded at her waist, and her face composed into an expression that gave away nothing beyond the fact that it had been composed on purpose, and this, Elsie understood before anyone said so, was the Dowager. Augusta Ashworth did not descend to meet her. She waited until Elsie had climbed the steps herself, and then she looked at her the way Elsie imagined a draper looked at cloth brought in from an uncertain mill, checking the weave before checking the colour. "So," the Dowager said, "the wool merchant's daughter." Elsie held her eyes and did not look away first. "The wool merchant is dead, your grace," she said. "I am only his daughter now." Something crossed the older woman's face too quickly to be read, and was gone before it could be named, and she said only, "Come inside. The heat will spoil the flowers before it spoils anything else," and turned without waiting to see if she was obeyed. Gabriel offered his arm at the door. Elsie noticed, without meaning to notice it, that his eyes went once, briefly, to a corridor on the west side of the hall where the shutters stood closed in the middle of a bright afternoon, and that a housemaid passing that way carried her tray with her eyes fixed straight ahead, the particular carefulness of someone stepping past a room she had been told not to look at. Elsie asked nothing. She had learned already, in one afternoon, that this was a house where questions arrived before they were wanted, and she filed the shuttered corridor away beside the swan that swam alone. 2 facts with no story yet attached to either of them, and let herself be led in to be married. The ceremony was held the following noon in the estate's own chapel, small enough that the guests spilled out into the churchyard beyond the open doors, and Elsie stood through it, aware of eyes on the back of her gown, the way one is aware of a draught. She heard the name Thessaly twice before the vows were even spoken, murmured behind gloved hands by women who assumed a bride from a mill town could not follow the currents of their own gossip, and she found she could follow it perfectly well. 14 months, one of them said. He has not so much as danced since. And here is this one, said another, straight off a cart of wool, poor thing. Does she know what she has married into? She knows what she was told to know. The first one answered, and that is rarely the same thing. Gabriel's hand did not tremble when he took hers at the rail, but she felt the exact moment his composure cost him something. A held breath released a half-second too late, and she understood before any document ever told her, so that the man beside her was not merely mourning a wife. He was carrying her. At the wedding breakfast that followed, laid out under the limes because the day would not cool, a cousin came to offer his congratulations with a warmth so evenly measured it might have been poured from a jug. Reginald Ashworth was handsome in the particular way of a man who has never once had to hurry, and his smile arrived a half-second before his eyes joined it, and did not stay a half-second after it left, so that Elsie had the odd impression, shaking his hand, of being greeted by two different men occupying the same excellent coat. "Cousin," he said to Gabriel, "you have chosen a practical bride, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to pay." "Practical is a word men use," Elsie said, "when they have decided a woman's virtues can be counted rather than admired." Reginald laughed, delighted, as though she had performed a trick for him. "Oh, she'll do very well here." Gabriel did not laugh. He watched his cousin's hand rest a moment too long on Elsie's, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not yet name, gone before it surfaced, folded back under the same composure that had cost him something at the rail. Later, when the light had gone long and gold and most of the guests had drunk enough to stop watching, Gabriel found her at the edge of the lawn, where the limes gave way to open grass running down toward the mere. "I owe you an apology," he said, "before either of us is much older." "For what?" she asked. "For all of it," he said, "for the manner of it, for the debt, for the fact that you were handed a solution to a problem you did not create and asked to be grateful for it." "I have not asked to be grateful," Elsie said. "No," he said, "you have not. That is the first true thing that has been said to me all day." He looked out at the water a long moment, and his hand, she noticed, had gone without his seeming to notice it to the inside of his own wrist. 2 fingers pressed there as though counting something. "I will not pretend to you that this house is a happy one," he said. "I would rather you learn it from me plainly than from the women under the limes." She married a man who spoke to her as though she deserved the truth before the comfort of it, and she went to bed that night not knowing yet what to make of that, only that it was not nothing. The room they gave her that night adjoined his by a single door, and she sat before the glass in her shift with her hair down, and her father's wren set on the table beside the candle, and she waited for the thing her aunts had promised her. "Weep and endure, endure, and it will pass. That is what your mother was told, and it did her no lasting harm." And she found she was not weeping, only waiting, which felt like its own kind of endurance. The door opened without a knock, since it was his right to open it, and Gabriel came in already in his shirt-sleeves, and stopped a careful distance from the bed, as though the distance itself were a piece of furniture he did not wish to disturb. "I have not come for what you were told to expect," he said. She did not answer at once. "Then what have you come for?" she asked. "To talk," he said, "if you are willing. If you are not, I will go, and no one beyond this room need ever know the difference." She looked at him a long moment in the candlelight, this man who had married her to settle a debt, and now stood in her bedchamber offering conversation as though it were the rarer gift, and she thought of Temperance's hands going still on the lacing that morning. It did them the harm it did them. We simply were not asked to watch, and she understood with sudden clarity that she was being asked. "Sit, then," she said, "since I do not think either of us wants me perched on the edge of that bed like a bird waiting to be let go." He almost smiled at that, the ghost of something arriving and retreating before it could properly land, and he sat. "I do not know how to make this easier for you," he said, "only how to make it honest. I did not choose this marriage to be cruel to you, and I did not choose it, if I am honest, entirely for the reasons my cousin gave the guests today." "Then what were the reasons?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "My mother believes a man who does not remarry within 2 years invites questions he cannot afford," he said finally. "My cousin believes a settled duke is a manageable one, and I believe, God help me, that I would rather share a house with a stranger who owes me nothing than with a woman I might come. In time. To fail the way I failed the last one." Elsie sat with that a moment, turning it the way she might have turned a bolt of cloth to check it for a flaw in the weave. "You did not fail her," she said. "You do not know that," he said, quietly, and there was no self-pity in it, only a flatness that frightened her more than tears would have. "I do not know it either. That is rather the trouble." A knock came at the outer door then, brisk, unapologetic, and a voice she already recognised as Reginald's called through it, with a warmth pitched exactly for the servants, who would surely be listening in the corridor. "All well in there, cousin," he called. "Only checking the house is settled for the night." Gabriel's jaw set, and something in his shoulders went the way stone goes when it has decided not to crack. "All is well," he said, through the door, his voice perfectly level. "Good night, Reginald." The footsteps retreated, unhurried, and Elsie noted, without yet knowing what to do with the noting, that a man checking whether a house was settled had chosen the one night in the year when checking was least required by any ordinary custom. Gabriel rose to go a little after. At the door he paused. "Whatever this marriage becomes," he said, "I would rather it become something we chose, slowly, than something we performed for an audience under the limes." "I can live with slowly," Elsie said. "It is rather what I am used to." He inclined his head, something almost warm in it, and left her to the candle and the wren, and a night that had not gone at all the way her aunts had prepared her for, weeping nowhere in it, endurance nowhere in it, only a bargain struck in the dark that she already suspected would cost her more than the debt ever had. Autumn came on slow and dry that year, the drought holding through September, so that the estate's account books, when she finally saw them, were thick with worried notations about the rents and the water in the lower fields, and it was the account books that changed everything. Though she did not know it, yet the morning she first asked to see them. She had grown restless in the weeks since the wedding, welcomed at Haramir the way a piece of new furniture is welcomed, admired for its usefulness and otherwise left in its corner, and it was Mr. Pruitt, the old steward who had run the house's practical business since before Gabriel's father died, who first noticed her fingers itching at the ledger spines in the estate office one wet afternoon. "You have the look of your father about you," he said, when he found her there, "though I never met the man." She looked up, startled. "You knew of him," she said. "Everyone in 3 counties knew of Thomas Hale's books," Pruitt said. "Cleanest hand in the wool trade, they used to say. A man who could find a farthing gone missing from 100 pages back without so much as squinting." She had not known that was said of her father beyond Cumbay Ashton, and something in her chest loosened at hearing it. The way a knot loosens when someone finally names it correctly. "Show me then," she said. And Pruitt, who was not a man easily surprised, looked at her a moment, and then simply did. She spent 3 afternoons with the estate ledgers before she found the first thread out of place, a rent entry from the lower farms, recorded twice in different hands, with a small but consistent difference between the figures. Not large enough to catch a careless eye, exactly large enough to matter over several years. She said nothing to Gabriel at first. She took her question instead to Temperance, who had come to visit for a fortnight, bearing a basket of preserves and an opinion about everything she saw, and who listened to the whole of it over tea with her head tilted like a bird, deciding whether a worm was worth the trouble. "Your father used to say a book that balances too easily has usually been made to," Temperance said. "He said it about the miller in Coombe Ashton, the year before he stopped buying from him." "And what happened to the miller?" Elsie asked. "He is still a miller," Temperance said, "in a different county, with a good deal less to account for." Pruitt, when she finally showed him the discrepancy, went very quiet over the page, turning it to the light the way a man checks a coin for the ring of good silver. "This is Mr. Reginald's hand on the second entry," he said at last. "He has kept the lower rents himself these 3 years, since the old bailiff retired." "Since before the late Duchess died," Elsie said, and watched something pass over the old steward's face that he did not try to explain to her. "That," he said carefully, "is a question you would do better to ask somewhere other than this office, Mrs. Ashworth, and I would ask it gently, if I were you, because a house does not always thank the hand that opens a window it has kept shut a long while. A book that hides one figure," he added, almost to himself, "generally hides them all." She turned the wren over in her pocket that night longer than she had in weeks, her thumb finding the unfinished wing without her looking for it, and she thought of her father's clean hand and the miller in another county now, and she decided quietly, without telling Gabriel yet, that she would find out exactly what else this house had been made to balance. She began with Lady Vivienne Carrow, whom she met properly for the first time at a small dinner the Dowager arranged that October, ostensibly to welcome the new Duchess into the county's better circles. In truth, Elsie suspected, to see how she would hold up under polite scrutiny. Vivienne was Thessaly's cousin, and had been her closest friend since girlhood, and she watched Elsie across the table all evening, with an expression that was not unkind, only careful, the look of someone guarding a door she had been guarding a long time. They found themselves alone afterward in the small library, and Elsie, who had decided that directness cost less in the end than caution, asked her plainly whether Thessaly had been happy. Vivienne set down her glass with great precision. "That is not a question anyone in this house has asked me in 14 months, she said. "No," Elsie said. "I imagine it is not." Vivienne studied her a long moment. "You are not at all what Reginald described to me before the wedding," she said. "And what did he describe?" Elsie asked. "A convenience," Vivienne said. "Practical, grateful. I begin to think Reginald describes every woman he has not troubled to look at as practical and grateful," Elsie said, and something like the beginning of a real smile moved across Vivienne's face before it settled back into caution. "Thessaly was not happy," Vivienne said finally, "but not for the reason the gossips believe, and not because of Gabriel, whatever they whisper under the limes. She had found something in the last months that frightened her badly, and she would not tell even me the whole of it, only that it concerned money, and that it concerned family, and that she meant to bring it to Gabriel the week she died." Elsie felt the room go very still around her. "What became of it?" she asked. "I do not know," Vivienne said. "I have wondered every day since whether it went into the mere with her." She confronted Reginald herself 2 weeks later, in the estate office, under the excuse of a rent question, and found him exactly as charming and exactly as unmovable as she had expected. "The lower farms have always run thin margins," he said, spreading his hands with the easy patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a child. "Drought does not read a ledger before it ruins a crop, Mrs. Ashworth, and a bailiff's hand grows careless with age. That is all this is, carelessness, not conspiracy. You have been reading too many novels in that library." She noted, without saying so, that he had not once looked at the actual figures she laid before him. "I find carelessness rarely repeats itself in exactly the same amount 3 years running," she said. He smiled, the smile arriving before his eyes did, staying after they had already moved on to something else. "You have a fine head for figures," he said, "for a wool merchant's daughter. It is really no surprise your father did so poorly, and left you so much debt to marry off, is it? Numbers alone were never enough to keep a business afloat. One needs friends as well. and friends, my dear, are not so easily balanced in a column." She did not answer that. She only watched him leave, unhurried, and she went that same afternoon down to the mere alone, where the single swan still moved across the water with the patience of something that had stopped expecting company. And she stood a long while with the wren pressed hard in her fist, and she understood, with the particular clarity of a thing finally named correctly, that Reginald Ashworth had just told her, in the guise of an insult, precisely how her father's debt had come to exist in the first place. She found Thessaly's diary 11 days later, not through any cleverness of her own, but through Nell, the youngest of the housemaids, who had been sweeping the shuttered west corridor on a morning she was not supposed to, and had found, wedged behind a loose skirting board where a careless hand had once hidden it in haste, a small marbled book with a broken clasp. Nell brought it to Elsie rather than to the dowager, in the kitchen, at night, her hands shaking. "Because," she said, "you're the only one in this house who's ever asked me my name twice." Elsie read it alone at her own table with the candle burned low, and the handwriting inside, careful at first and then increasingly hurried toward the last pages, told her everything Vivienne had not known, and everything Reginald had almost admitted without meaning to. Thessaly had found, copied in her own hand for safekeeping, 3 years of rent entries that did not match the tenant's own receipts, a difference that had been quietly diverted through Reginald's private accounts and dressed up as necessary repairs to fields that had never been repaired. She had confronted him once, gently, hoping for an honest explanation, and his answer, recorded in Thessaly's own words, chilled Elsie more than any threat could have. "Because it had been delivered," Thessaly wrote, with a smile the entire time, as though we were discussing the weather and not 4 years of my husband's tenants going hungry. Gabriel found Elsie with the diary open on the table when he came looking for her past midnight, and his face, in the candlelight, went through several things at once before it settled on something very close to fear. "Where did you get that?" he said, and his voice had a rawness in it she had not heard from him before. "Nell found it, behind the skirting in the west corridor," Elsie said. "Gabriel, I think Thessaly knew something about Reginald's accounts. I think she meant to tell you the very week she died. He did not move to take the book from her. He stood very still, 2 fingers pressed to his own wrist without his seeming to know he had done it, and when he spoke his voice had gone somewhere far away. I searched that corridor myself," he said, "the week after. I searched every room she had ever set foot in, because I could not understand why a woman with everything to live for would walk into that water, alone, and I never thought, God forgive me, I never once thought to look behind a skirting board, because I never once considered that someone might have put her there to look for something." The door behind them opened before either of them could say more, and Reginald stood in it, still dressed for the evening, his eyes moving once, quickly, to the small marbled book in Elsie's hands, and whatever composure he had worn all autumn slipped for exactly as long as it takes a hand to reach half a step too far toward a table before catching itself. "What a very late hour," he said, "for a wife and husband to be reading in bed," and his voice had lost, just for that half-second, the warmth that usually arrived a beat before his eyes. Gabriel did not answer him. He looked instead at Elsie, and something in his face closed the way a door closes when a wind has been let in that a house was not built to hold, and he said only, "We will speak of this in the morning," and left the room without looking at his cousin again, and Elsie stood alone with the diary and the wren, and the particular ruin of a night that had begun with a discovery, and ended, somehow exactly where every discovery in that house seemed to end, with someone she loved walking away from her rather than toward the truth. Morning brought no comfort, only Reginald arriving early and composed once more, sitting with the dowager in the small parlour as though he had rehearsed the scene overnight, which Elsie supposed he had. "It grieves me more than I can say," he told Augusta, "that a young bride so soon in a new house should feel the need to go creeping about locked corridors inventing conspiracies from a dead woman's private grief. Thessaly was not well those last months. Everyone in this house knows it, and a diary written by an unhappy mind is not evidence of anything but unhappiness." Augusta's face gave away nothing, but her eyes, when they found Elsie's, held a coldness Elsie had not earned since the day she arrived. "Is this true," Augusta asked, "that you have been in the west corridor?" "It is true," Elsie said. "I did not go looking for a conspiracy, your grace. I went looking for the truth of a woman nobody in this house has been permitted to grieve properly. And I found rent entries copied in her own hand that do not match a single tenant's receipt from the lower farms. Reginald's laugh arrived smooth and warm as ever, or a grieving woman's fancy, copied from figures she misread. It happens, your grace. Women left too long alone with their own thoughts do strange arithmetic. It was Pruitt, standing by the door where he had not been asked to stand. Who spoke then, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had kept his opinions to himself for 3 decades, and had run out of patience for keeping them any longer. "Begging your pardons," he said, "but I have kept this estate's books alongside Mr. Reginald for 11 years, and I have never once, in 11 years, seen a woman's fancy match a bailiff's own hand 3 years running." The room went very still. Augusta turned to look at him the way she had first looked at Elsie on the steps, checking the weave. "That will be all, Pruitt," she said. But there was less certainty in it now than there had been. Later that same week the dowager summoned Elsie alone, and offered her, in the careful, bloodless language of a woman accustomed to arranging unpleasant things quietly, a settlement, a house of her own in a distant county, a generous annuity, and a quiet annulment on grounds that need never be spoken aloud, if she would simply agree to trouble the family no further with a dead woman's papers. "I am not offering you this to punish you," Augusta said. "I am offering it because a marriage without peace is worse than no marriage at all, and because I have watched my son carry one dead wife already, and I will not watch him ruin himself chasing the ghost of her supposed murder over a rent ledger." "I did not marry your son to be paid to disappear," Elsie said, and the words came out of her steadier than she felt. "I was handed to him to settle a debt I never owed, and I have found since that the debt itself may have been invented by the very man now urging everyone to look away from it. I would rather be unhappy honestly, your grace, than content on borrowed lies." That night Gabriel came to her not to talk, this time, but to end things, gently, in the manner of a man convinced he was doing her a kindness. "You should take my mother's offer," he said. "I have brought you nothing but danger and a house full of ghosts, and I would rather send you away whole than keep you here to be broken, the way I broke Thessaly." "I did not ask you to protect me by throwing me out," Elsie said. "You are not protecting me. You are protecting yourself from having to watch what happens next." He did not answer that, and his silence was worse than any argument, and she understood, watching him not move toward her, that he had already decided, and that some sendings away look exactly like rejection even when they are meant as love, and she packed the wren and little else and went back to Coombe Ashton before the week was out, to a cottage kitchen that smelled of tallow and lavender water, just as it had the morning she left it, and Temperance held her without a single word about weeping or enduring. And that, more than anything said in the parlour at Haramir, was what finally broke her. It was Vivienne Caro who would not let it end there, arriving at the cottage a fortnight later still in her travelling cloak, with a second book Elsie had not known existed, Thessaly's own correspondence copied and kept safe by Vivienne herself the day her cousin died, out of a grief too raw at the time to know what to do with it. "I have been a coward for 14 months, Vivienne said, sitting at Temperance's small table as though she had never sat anywhere grander. I did not come forward because I told myself it would not bring her back, and I have watched a good man punish himself in her place ever since, and now I have watched him send away the first person willing to ask the question honestly. And I find I would rather be brave a little too late than careful forever." Between the two of them, Elsie's ledger pages and Thessaly's letters, the whole shape of it finally stood clear enough to be spoken aloud in one room. And it was Pruitt who arranged the room, quietly, over Reginald's protests, calling the family and the tenants and the county's own magistrate to Haramir, on the pretence of settling the lower farm's disputed rents once and for all. A pretence thin enough that everyone arriving suspected it hid something larger, and thick enough that no one could refuse the invitation without looking guilty of exactly that. The library was full past its chairs the evening it happened, tenants standing along the walls beside cousins twice removed, Augusta seated with her hands folded and her face set for whatever was coming, Gabriel standing near the window with the stillness of a man braced against weather, and Reginald arriving last, unhurried as ever, taking a seat as though he had been asked to judge the proceedings rather than answer for them. Elsie stood at the long table with the ledgers open before her, Thessaly's diary beside them, Vivienne's letters beside that, and she read the entries aloud, not accusing, only reading, the exact figures against the exact receipts, so that everyone in that room heard the same numbers in the same order at the same moment, and could not later claim to have understood them differently. A ledger only ever tells you what someone wanted remembered, she said, when she had finished the figures, but a woman's own hand, copying them in fear the week before she died, tells you what she was afraid nobody would ever be permitted to remember at all. Reginald's composure held through most of it, the smile arriving on schedule, the warmth pitched correctly for an audience of tenants and cousins, until Pruitt set the final receipt, signed by Reginald's own hand 3 years past, and matching Thessaly's copied figure to the shilling. Directly in front of him on the table, and it was then, reaching for that single page as though he might make it disappear, by the same easy motion that had made 4 years of shillings disappear, that his hand moved a half-second too fast and a half-inch too far, and the whole room saw it, and saw, in the same instant, exactly what the smile had always been covering. "I built nothing you would not all have spent regardless," he said, and his voice for the first time all evening had no warmth left in it at all, only the flat arithmetic of a man finally caught adding wrong. The estate would have bled the same amount into bad harvests and worse husbands. I only decided where it bled to. "That is not an argument," Augusta said, rising for the first time, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "That is a confession dressed as economics, and I have been slow, God forgive me, slower than I have ever been slow about anything, because I judged this girl by the cut of her cloth the first afternoon she stood on my steps, and I judged you, Reginald, by the cut of yours, and I was wrong about both of you in exactly opposite directions." Reginald looked once around the room, at the tenants who would not meet his eyes now, at Gabriel who had not moved from the window, and something passed briefly over his face that was almost fear, almost grief, gone before anyone could be certain they had seen it at all, and he inclined his head with the last of his composure intact. "You have played it well, cousin," he said to Gabriel, "better than I gave you credit for," and he left the room without being asked twice, and the magistrate followed him out, and the library emptied slowly around the two people who had not spoken to each other directly all evening. Gabriel crossed to her once the room had cleared, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the fire settling in the grate the only sound between them. "I sent you away," he said finally, "because I could not bear to watch this house cost you what it cost her. And I told myself that was love. And I have had a fortnight now to understand that it was only fear wearing love's coat." "You did not ask me," Elsie said. "You decided, the way this whole house decides things for the people it claims to be protecting, and I would rather you had trusted me to choose my own danger." "I am asking now," he said. "It is rather late for asking," she said, but she did not move away from him, and something in her voice had already forgiven what her words had not yet allowed. "I have terms, before you mistake this for a simple yes." "Name them," he said, and did not look away. "I will not be sent anywhere again for my own good without being asked first," she said. "I will keep this house's books myself, alongside Pruitt, because I have found I am rather good at it, and I do not intend to stop. And I will grieve Thessaly properly, in this house, with you, because a woman who tried to do right by your tenants deserves better than a shuttered corridor, and a name nobody says above a whisper." He was quiet a moment, and then he reached for her wrist, gently, and pressed 2 fingers there the way he always did to his own, except this time it was not memory he was searching for, but simply the pulse of her, present, unhurried, alive under his hand, and something in his shoulders let go that had not let go in 14 months. "I accept every one of your terms," he said, "and I will add one of my own if you will have it." "Name it," she said. "Talk to me," he said, plainly, "the way I asked you to that first night, for the whole of however long we are given." They were married again in the small chapel the following spring, quietly, with only the household and Coombe Ashton in attendance, and Temperance wept through the whole of it, despite 40 years of insisting she never wept at weddings. And Prudence declared the magpies that morning had come in a pair, which everyone agreed was a very good omen indeed. A year on, Elsie stood again in her aunt's cottage kitchen, dressing for the harvest supper. The same low room, the same mirror, gone slightly foxed at one corner, and this time it was Gabriel who stood behind her, doing up the last of the laces, with hands far better suited to a sword than a hook and eye, muttering good-naturedly that a duke ought by rights to have a valet for this sort of work, and Temperance telling him from the doorway that a duke who wanted breakfast in that kitchen would do the lacing himself and be glad of the practice. On the table beside the candle sat the wren, both wings finished now, the second one carved slow and careful over a long winter, by hands that had never whittled before, and had insisted on learning, and beside it sat a smaller carving still rough at the edges, a second bird begun for the child Elsie was carrying, and not yet due to be finished, one wing whole. One wing waiting, the way all the best things in that house had learned to wait for the right hands to complete them. Down at the mere that evening, when they walked the shore together after the supper, 2 swans moved across the water side by side in the last of the light, and neither of them said anything about it, because by then it no longer needed saying. And that, more than the ledgers set right or the vows spoken twice, was how Elsie knew the wound had actually closed. If this one kept you warm tonight, stay by the fire with us a little longer, because the kettle is still on, and there is always another story waiting its turn in the dark. If it was the wren that stayed with you, or Temperance's dry good sense, or the moment Gabriel finally asked instead of decided, tell us which one held you, in a word below, and settle in with night-channel _name Normandy, so the next tale finds you when it is ready. The wick is burning low here, so sleep gently tonight. Be kind to the people keeping their own quiet ledgers, and we will have another one lit and waiting for you soon.